This episode includes discussion of child death, suicide, postpartum mental illness, criminal charges, and psychiatric crisis. Please take care of yourself while listening. If you or someone you love is pregnant, postpartum, or experiencing frightening thoughts, hallucinations, paranoia, severe insomnia, suicidal thoughts, or thoughts of harming yourself or someone else, please seek help immediately. Postpartum psychosis is a medical emergency. On the evening of January 24th, 2023, Patrick Clancy left home to pick up dinner. It was the kind of errand parents run without thinking. A takeout order, a stop at CVS. One of those ordinary trips that fit into the rhythm of family life. You leave the house for a little while. You come back. You put food on the table. You finish the bedtime routine. You move through the rest of the night like you have so many nights before. Nothing about that drive should have marked the dividing line between the life Patrick knew and the life he would return to. But by the time he came home, everything had changed. This is the story that sits at the center of Motherhood on Trial. Not because it is easy to understand, because it is not. Not because the public agrees about what happened, because it does not. And not because any explanation can undo the loss of 3 children, because nothing can. This is the story of Cora, Dawson, and Callan Clancy. A father whose grief became public, a mother now facing trial, and a question that still does not have a simple answer. What happens when a medical crisis becomes a criminal case?
Welcome to Motherhood on Trial from Unspoken Truths Media. I'm Beth Justice.
And I am Autumn Cross. And this series is not just about a criminal case. It is a series about motherhood, medicine, mental illness, grief. It's also about criminal responsibility.
Yeah.
And what happens in the legal system when crimes and court cases collide. We want to say that this at the very beginning. Okay, we are not doctors.
Nope.
We are not lawyers. We are simply mothers that had similar experiences from some of the women that we had looked into from various cases. We had similar symptoms. They weren't as vast and severe, but this is a passion for us, and it has been in the works for 2.5 years. And we thought at one time that we were going to get to do this at Court TV, and then, priorities shift in corporate media. And we've still continued this journey and continued to do it on our own. And we are extremely proud of ourselves for this beautiful docuseries that we are going to put out and share with you guys in hopes of making a change and bringing awareness to a very severe but treatable illness.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the case of Lindsay Clancy. For true crime lovers, this is a case you've heard of and talked about because this has been going on for a few years now, waiting to come to trial. So we've been following it since the very beginning. And it was this case in particular that Autumn and I decided we wanted to do this project because we saw so much of ourselves in the defendant. And we saw this in other women too, who struggled with similar issues. And we're both journalists. So we decided we'd take an approach to this as a journalist would, asking all the questions we could to learn all the information we could to determine whether this was truly a medical emergency or murder. And that's the crux of the question of this case. But what we ought to do first is slow things down a bit, because in our line of work, everything is about headlines. Everything is about quick information. And it's very easy to quickly move to blame the healthcare system, the family. There's all these people that people want to point fingers at. And honestly, we understand why people do that, because some of this is so incredibly painful. Like, it's hard to even discuss for me. And I'm used to some pretty heavy, dark stuff.
Yeah, we do. Completely. That's a good point. This case could be triggering. It's very serious. It's very sad. And there are a lot of layers, and it is not black and white like most people want to believe it is. This case involves the death of 3 children, 3 very young children. There's no way to talk about this lightly or to soften the reality of this, okay? There is really no way to discuss postpartum psychosis, legal insanity, medical treatment, or the criminal responsibility behind this case without first discussing and talking about the victims and what was lost in this case. So before we talk about Lindsay Clancy and go into the criminal aspect of her trial and the different layers, we want to begin with the children before we talk about the arguments, the case, and the different aspects of this diagnosis.
Cora was 5. She loved the color purple. She was at that age where your imagination is everything to you. And her favorite color and her favorite character became a part of her world. Who was 3, Patrol, and Callan was the baby, who was only 8 months old. He was still just discovering the world through faces and through the people who loved him. Those were the Clancy children.
Today, there is a playground in Duxbury that honors them, a purple play structure for Cora, a firefighter activity panel for Dawson, a toddler area for Callan. And these details matter, not because a playground can ever tell the story of a child's life, but because it gives people that cared about these children something real to hold on to. It reminds the world that these were not just names in a headline. These were real children. They had personalities, lives, favorite things, families, and they mattered. At the center of this family is Patrick Clancy. He was a husband and a father, and a man who left home for what should have been a normal errand and returned home to something that he should never have to face, and that we can't even fathom what this man endured on that day. One of the things that actually surprised us early in our research was how often we kept coming back to Patrick. He was very supportive of Lindsay, and of course, he's dealing with unimaginable grief,
Patrick's public statements. I'm going to read you some of these quotes. He had those 3 precious kids taken, and he asked the public to find a way to forgive his wife. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that my husband would do that. He also said that the real Lindsay was generously loving and caring. Our marriage was wonderful and diametrically grew stronger as her condition rapidly worsened. So I think he was very aware that there was a problem. And I'm sure he dealt with some, serious hindsight guilt.
Yeah.
Heartbreaking. Interesting.
Very, very heartbreaking. That is important about Patrick. And not because his grief decides the legal case, because it doesn't. I mean, there's so many people that have their
different responses.
Yeah, and their loved ones pleading their case and defending them, but that doesn't always decide. That doesn't matter in the court of law. And it's not because he was very compassionate towards his wife. That does not answer the question of criminal responsibility either. But because his response reminds us that people closest to a tragedy often experience it in ways that the public cannot fully understand. And that's what we're saying. It's gray. And so many people want this straight black and white. We want to see this villain, and we want to just
justice
and stone her and, let's just crucify her, you know? And that's not the way it is. And the rest of us are looking at it from the outside looking in, and he's on the inside. And he was living it, and that matters. And to still have that kind of compassion is huge. And it tells a bigger story, too, about what kind of person he is and what kind of, when you see a person that's that compassionate and that's, truly grieving and that has suffered such a great loss. As we started our research into this, we realized that if we were going to understand the arguments around the case, then we had to understand the family and what was going on behind the scenes as much as we could. And that means that we had to go backwards, because the story did not begin on January the 24th, 2023. It began months and months earlier. honestly, small symptoms could have been showing up years before.
According to the records that we've reviewed, things were pretty good until her second child, and then got progressively worse after her third. And this is very common in the postpartum psychosis cases that we've seen in the past. A lot of times it comes with multiple children. Your chances just increase, and you're more at risk for this very serious but treatable disorder.
So postpartum psychosis is I will actually give you the full definition, is a rare but severe psychiatric emergency that can occur after childbirth. It is characterized by loss of contact with reality and may include delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, severe confusion. Unlike postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety, postpartum psychosis is considered a medical emergency because it can place both the mother and her child at immediate risk if left untreated. We did a deep dive into postpartum psychosis because I suffered with postpartum anxiety and Beth with postpartum depression. In the legal system, a prosecutor is going to say, well, she was GPSing Patrick going to how long it would take him to go to CVS and then to the restaurant to pick up the food and then back. I'm not even going to lie to you. I do that often.
Yeah.
How's traffic? How long is it going to take you to get back? The kids are all hungry, especially when you have little kids and they need to eat because they get crazy if you do not feed them.
Yep.
I can just see there's so many different ways to present those facts. You can't just say, oh, she was planning it.
Yeah. And that's exactly what her attorneys are going to do. They're going to try to poke holes in that.
Exactly.
Before they were at the center of a nationally watched criminal trial, Patrick and Lindsay Clancy were simply a young couple building the life they had always wanted. Patrick grew up on the Massachusetts South Shore in a large family. He built a career in software sales. Lindsay grew up in Connecticut. She earned a biology degree from Quinnipiac University, completed an accelerated nursing program at Massachusetts Gen Hospital, where she later became a labor and delivery nurse, a job that she deeply loved. She was described by friends and coworkers as compassionate, positive, and someone who genuinely cared for her patients. The couple met in 2013. One of Patrick's cousins introduced them while Lindsay was at nursing school. They married in December 2016, and by all public accounts, they were excited to start a family together. On Christmas Eve, 2017, they welcomed their first child, Cora. Like so many young families, they were balancing careers, new parenthood, and dreams that they had for the future. From the outside, up to this point, they looked like a family building a happy life together. Up until this point, nothing gave any sign that there was something wrong with the marriage or the family. Everything looked perfect, even though it does always look perfect from social media at that point. But according to all accounts, there was no mental health issues that were on file. We will know more once that comes out in trial, but looking back right now, things seemed good.
Less than 2 years later, the Clancys welcomed their second child, Dawson, and Patrick later described these years as busy, joyful, and centered around family life, which if you have small children, I'm sure that you can completely empathize with that. Lindsay continued working part-time as a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital at this time, often taking overnight shifts so she could spend more time at home with the children during the day. Friends and family described her as deeply devoted to motherhood, and for all accounts, she was a great mother. Like many women, Lindsay experienced postpartum anxiety after the births of Cora and Dawson. According to Patrick, those earlier struggles improved with therapy, exercise, meditation, and time. While challenging, they eventually stabilized and allowing their life to move forward. In May of 2022, the family welcomed their third beautiful son, Callan. But this postpartum period would prove to be very different for Lindsay. Over the next several months, according to public reporting, court filings, and Patrick's later accounts, Lindsay's mental health steadily declined. She began experiencing worsening anxiety, severe insomnia, depression, appetite changes, intrusive thoughts, suicidal ideation, and repeated medication changes. She sought help from multiple healthcare providers, was prescribed numerous psychiatric medications, and was eventually hospitalized at McLean Hospital before being discharged home just weeks before the tragedy. Throughout that time, the family continued trying to live what appeared to be an ordinary life. These were days where there were birthday parties, holiday celebrations, pediatric appointments, and photos of the children playing in the snow, and even text messages about dinner and everyday parenting. From the outside, much of it looked remarkably normal. Inside the home, however, according to those closest to the family, they were navigating an increasingly serious mental health crisis. And on January the 24th, 2023, what began as another ordinary day would become one of the most devastating family tragedies in recent history.
So the more that we dug into this timeline, we kept looking at these worsening symptoms. And we really did focus on what they meant and what they look like when we're talking about intrusive thoughts, suicidal thoughts, because as a person who went through postpartum depression myself, I thought I kind of knew a little bit about what it was. It wasn't until we started talking to mental health professionals that I started realizing that I really didn't know or couldn't comprehend the level that this was. I have an idea because I was at the probably very beginning of that, starting to seep through. But after learning about what, we always joke all the time, like, I'm exhausted or I'm sleep deprived. Sleep deprivation in someone who's going through a psychiatric emergency is different than I only got 4 hours last night.
Right. It's totally different. And I can remember with my struggles with postpartum anxiety that I had sleep deprivation. And when you're going through postpartum issues, not even to the caliber of, a psychosis, but the hormones, the lack of sleep, just the strain on your body, the whole change, the whole package together, I would say.
Yeah.
Is a whole nother level of sleep deprivation. And I wanted to stop for a minute here and explain what intrusive thoughts. I know we've thrown that out there a couple of times as well, and I'll give you the definition for that as well. Intrusive thoughts are unwanted, distressing thoughts or mental images that suddenly enter a person's mind. They are often violent, frightening, or completely out of character. Importantly, the person experiencing them usually recognizes that the thoughts are wrong and does not want to act on them. So if you have that where you realize I'm not going to act on these are wrong, that is not postpartum psychosis. It is a part, intrusive thoughts is a part of, a mental health struggle. It is, I had them. Yep. And I can remember with my first child, I wasn't as sick with him as I was my second child, but I can remember one night I had a friend that had 2 children before me, and during the night, I was super sleep deprived, and I was a little sick, but not as severe. And he screamed all night. He wouldn't sleep. And I can just remember crying and crying and crying and holding him. And I just wanted to throw him up against the wall. And then I immediately started crying my eyes out, thinking, what is wrong with me?
Yeah.
Why would I even think something like that? And I called my friend and she said, the difference between you and somebody that's not okay, which she does work in the medical field, she said, is that you stopped yourself. You realized that that's wrong and that, you were feeling something unhealthy and you reached out to me.
Yeah.
And I also reached out to my doctor. So I was very lucky to have the support that I had. And some people aren't as fortunate.
Yeah. Because I had similar feelings and I just kept them inside. Now I knew they were bad. So I can't tell you I was feeling terrible for thinking it. Or I remember thinking like something's wrong. This isn't right. Like it took me 5 years to get pregnant with my first child. I shouldn't be feeling this way. I should be happy, not like depressed and crying. And it was very strange, but you're right. Like I didn't have a friend in the mental health field and I had a doctor, but it was like when I got in the doctors, they're just like, hey, how you doing? Fill out this little questionnaire. Are you good? Okay, bye. It was very like, they didn't want to listen to my problems.
Mine was, I'm very blessed and fortunate to have her. And if you're in the Atlanta area, reach out and I'll give you her name. But she is still to this day amazing and just for all aspects of womanhood, not just maternal mental health. So she's an amazing OB/GYN, but it's nice to have, and it's very important to have a support system and medical professionals that understand you and understand what you're going through.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to in there and discuss what intrusive thoughts were.
I think, though, that's kind of what I'm thinking, though. As we were looking through all these different terms and figuring out what they meant, I kept thinking, like, we're going to find this one thing, this like needle in a haystack that's going to be like, this is why she's what didn't premeditate. But it just, the more we learn, the more I kept thinking, I'm just more confused. Like, if this is a medical emergency and she already had been going to these doctors, how the hell did we end up here?
Mm-hmm.
And, that's what I want to get into, because there's a lot of reasons why it's happening. Why I have covered so many cases of infanticide.
And that's another term. You want to tell them what
Oh.
infanticide is?
Infanticide is when a child dies at the hand of their parent. It can be a mom or a dad.
Within a year.
Within a year of their birth. So, yeah. And so, anyway, we're going to get into why that is so common and why America is actually different than other places in the world of how you handle these kind of cases.
And we're also going to get into the legal system and psychology. That is what's huge about this case, is psychology is sometimes, it's not black and white, and it's not, it's not like a test that's definitive.
It's a little political if you think about it.
It's crazy to think, that's a bad term to use.
Yeah, I know. We're not into politics.
We're not into politics, and I'm sorry that I just used the word crazy, but to talk about psychology, I'm sorry. But no, but it's crazy. There I go again. It blows my mind. We'll say that there's really no room for psychology in the legal system. Like that's what's so.
Because anything you have a medical opinion, there is someone else who has the exact opposite medical opinion, and both sides will bring forth those experts. We can expect that with Lindsay Clancy. It's going to get interesting.
I mean, it's just. Psychology is of the mind, but you have people that think, oh, you're fine, suck it up. But, there's also people like me personally who believe that if you're depressed, you need medication just as much as you would need medication if you had diabetes. So we're going to get into that is what we're trying to say, the legal system. So back on track here. What we found was not a straight line with their history, their family, and the situation that evolved over the births and the growth of their family. It was a maze, and the symptoms changed. Lindsay's medications changed. Different terms appeared in different conversations with different providers: depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive symptoms, intrusive thoughts, and suicidal ideation, psychosis. And we started to realize that part of the public confusion around this case came from the fact that many of us use the psychiatric language imprecisely.
We just don't use it right at all.
We don't understand it. And that's what fascinated us when we got into researching and interviewing these professionals in this field. It's so vast. And there's so many things that we had no idea that we were going through, that even existed, that Lindsay was going through. It's just really hard when you don't understand. To try to understand the whole case, you have to have all the facts.
Yeah.
And with the facts come understanding these psychiatric, illnesses and treatments.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what surprised me the most out of this whole project was I've been using a lot of these words often for other cases, like bipolar disorder. Used it in my own personal life. I'm like, oh, she's totally bipolar. You know what I mean? Like, it becomes like a part of your language. Some people now, they don't even say like, they just say in postpartum, like she's got postpartum. Like, what does that even mean? In postpartum actually makes sense. It's a period of time after you have a baby, but she's dealing with postpartum or using baby blues.
Yeah.
I remember my own mother saying something like, this is normal to be down afterwards. So you almost immediately start to minimize what you're feeling because you think that it's okay, when in reality, we don't really know. We all could be educated.
Absolutely. And the baby blues, we learned, is different from postpartum depression. And if you are questioning that, reach out to a healthcare professional. Even if you don't have the means, there's so many different resources out there where people will help you and can, and again, we're going to put those out there for everyone to utilize.
They're on our website too.
Yes.
UnspokenTruthsMedia.com.
But medically and legally, is what we're trying to say here. They do not mean the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. I do think I'm going to stop for one quick second and say why the language matters so much, especially in Lindsay's case. So criminal responsibility asks whether someone can be held legally responsible for their actions at the time of the offense, not simply whether they committed the act. We know the act was committed. The defense is not denying that the act was committed, but they are saying that when the act was committed, she should not be held criminally responsible because she was legally insane. And legal insanity is another funny thing because this is not a medical diagnosis. Someone doesn't go, oh, legally insane, and then that's it. They don't. The legal standard actually varies state by state, so it gets really confusing. And to find out what it means, you have to look up the actual governance for that state. In Massachusetts law, it doesn't even ask whether someone had a mental illness. It asks whether that mental illness is so severe that at the moment of the alleged crime, the person lacked criminal responsibility. So that's why this case sits as this weird intersection of medicine and law. Doctors are the ones diagnosing the illnesses, but the jury is deciding the criminal responsibility. Those questions are related, but they're not the same question. And I think that also once you get into the medical side of things, it makes it a lot more complicated because jurors are just everyday people. They're not doctors. They're not lawyers. They're just people. And they're going to have to explain these complex ideas at trial in a way that can resonate with the jury.
It's going to be very difficult.
It's going to be awful. You know, I was watching another podcast actually, or listening, and they were saying that someone who was reporting there on the day it happened, they didn't really know what was going on, but the law enforcement were walking out of the house and they were just crying. They were all sobbing. And that hits a trigger for us because in this line of work, you really have to put up a wall. Like we use humor sometimes, even though it's not funny, but it helps us like not think about how serious it is so that we can actually like stomach and get through our day or our story. So when you see police officers who are dealing with this all the time and they're crying, you're like, this is bad. Mm-hmm. And I feel for them. I don't know how I would have been crying.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was all that to say is that this became a bigger case once we realized that we have to focus on, does she meet the legal standard for criminal responsibility? But prevention asks a different question. Prevention asks, how do we recognize the crisis before the crime? That's what we want to talk about. We know what happened is absolutely gut-wrenching. How do we stop it from happening again? One of the things that really was difficult about this case was the way it was discussed. We've talked about language and how language is so important. And I think in this case specifically, you have a lot of people throwing around different terms. You have people saying postpartum psychosis. You have people saying criminal intent. You have people saying murder. And when all these words start talking together, people think that they understand what they mean. But the truth is, they're really just confused. This is especially important, I think, because the language in postpartum psychosis is misunderstood. So how are you supposed to effectively discuss a case when we're not even 100% sure of what it means? I think with postpartum psychosis, the biggest misconception I had when I was learning about it was that I thought it was going to be obvious. If you were in a postpartum psychosis medical emergency, I thought, well, you're just crazy, or you would be totally out of character, or it would be just like impossible to not know. But the more we talked with professionals, the more I realized that experts say it can wax and wane. It's much more complicated. It's not as black and white. Sometimes people who are going through postpartum psychosis could still function almost seemingly normal, doing everyday activities, ordering groceries, planning, appearing quote unquote normal. That was surprising to me. What about you?
What surprised me the most was that it wasn't a standalone diagnosis in the DSM. And the DSM is a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. So it's basically the manual that mental health care providers use to diagnose their patients. And I was very surprised that it wasn't listed in there and that there's not a lot of training yet for these experts. And psychiatric providers and maternal mental health experts, they recognize it as one of the most urgent psychiatric emergencies associated with childbirth. But this raises a real problem of communication.
Yeah.
How can something that is medically urgent, that's considered an emergency, be misunderstood all at the same time? How can you, in a court of law, if there's not even a diagnostic, way to diagnose it, I will say.
Yeah.
or a list of it in the manual that these mental health experts use, how can it even be presented in a court of law? Because then it's essentially basically an opinion.
Yeah.
Or a thought, because it's not a technical disorder or illness.
Right. And I think that's what is complicated about medicine in general, because really it is a bunch of opinions. I mean, every day we're putting our lives in the hands of people who are opining about your condition. And I think it's also why it's interesting in the courtroom, where you have multiple highly qualified experts testifying polar opposite explanations of something. But we are going to get into that in this series, because experts have a lot of reasons why it's not in the DSM and are actively working to try to get it in the DSM. When the case of Lindsay Clancy broke, it was a very confusing time, because everybody was talking about something different. We had people talking about depression. We had people talking about psychosis. We had people talking about criminal intent, murder. Like, it was coming from everywhere. People just trying to wrap their heads around this. And I think it, for me, is even more difficult because people were acting like they understood the language around postpartum psychosis. And to be fair, so did I. I thought I knew what that was until we started digging into this, until I started learning, like, it is very complicated and I'm just scratching at the surface of what I thought. So if you don't understand the core crux of it, how are you going to make a opinion about the case?
Exactly. And I think in the beginning, people just immediately, postpartum psychosis wasn't even, mentioned. I mean, honestly, people were like, she's just a monster. Why would she do that?
Yeah.
That's terrible.
When the case first broke, there was a lot of confusion. And I remember thinking, your first instinct is shock, but then people immediately started throwing out different terms, even before the prosecution announced its plan to seek murder charges. But there was just anger. There was people who were, automatically pro Lindsay right away. There were people who were like, this was obviously a medical thing. And then there were people who were like, she deserves the harshest punishment. And it became very confusing. And once postpartum psychosis pops up, I think then it becomes another layer of difficultness, because the language is all over the place. How you define that. We've talked about language, how people actually define postpartum psychosis, because when I first learned about it, I thought I understood it, and I was clearly wrong.
It's very complicated. I mean, it's fast, it's deep, it's a lot of different things that combine to diagnose it, and as well when you're in the state of a psychosis. It's extremely complicated, but we knew that there was something more to this story. What all these people were saying,
Yep.
What we were hearing, and that's why we immediately went into deep diving into her case and past cases and meeting with mental health experts, because we wanted to learn more about it, the why, the how can we help people, how can we advocate for this cause, especially when we learned that it was not in the DSM, and I'll get to that in a minute. But we started asking these experts a very basic question, okay? When most people hear the phrase postpartum psychosis, what is the most common misconception? What is misunderstood there? And I know what was misunderstood for me, and I'm sure you do too.
One of the biggest surprises for me was thinking that postpartum psychosis doesn't always look the way you imagined. In my mind, when you've reached a state of psychosis, you've lost it. You've gone off the deep end. There's no coming back. You are in that mindset. In my mind is what I thought. When I actually learned quickly that that's not true. In fact, in postpartum psychosis, you can look completely normal. You can be making phone calls, appointments, planning things, even appeared joyful, but still be going in and out of this state. And I didn't realize that. So someone who would be obviously ill I would think they would automatically know that this was dangerous. I would think that if this was your spouse, how could you not tell that they were in psychosis? That's when I realized that this was more difficult than I thought. What about you?
I think what surprised me the most was that it wasn't a standalone diagnosis in the DSM.
Yeah.
The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And that is the manual that mental health professionals use to diagnose their patients. And so it not being a standalone diagnosis, but yet psychiatric professionals and maternal mental health experts recognize it as one of the most urgent psychiatric emergencies associated with childbirth because of what can happen to the mother, to the child. It's definitely in a state of psychosis. A lot of people, they don't know what's going on. So it raises a real communication problem. How can something be medically urgent, legally important, and publicly misunderstood all at the same time? And when you add a criminal case on top of that, everything becomes even more complicated because the medical system is asking, what is happening to this person? The legal system is asking, what did she know, intend, and understand at the time of the crime? And families are asking, how do we miss this?
Yep.
If this is somebody we love and we live with every day, how do we miss this? And the public is asking, how could she do this? What kind of monster is she? So those are not the same questions. And when everyone is asking different questions, very easy for the conversation to break down. Communication, there's no bridge there to understand. So
that's why we're here.
That's why we're here.
We're going to try to answer all those questions.
Postpartum psychosis is very complicated, and we are trying to bridge the gap between the legal system and this rare illness that is not yet in the DSM and is very dangerous for families.
I think that, too, what you were just making me think of was that it is true that a lot of things could happen at the same time. Like she, could be going through this medical emergency, but she still killed her kids. So I think that's the hard part for a lot of people to understand, is having empathy for someone who's in a medical condition. And I was thinking about, we were interviewing someone, and it could have been Elizabeth O'Brien, but she was talking about if someone had a heart attack while they're driving their car and they got into an accident, someone was killed in the accident, would that person who had the heart attack go to prison for the rest of their life for murder? They would not. They had a medical emergency. And a lot of the experts we spoke to, all of them we spoke to, said this condition is a medical emergency that is treatable 100%. It's a treatable medical emergency. You know what I mean? So that I said that the waxing and waning was surprising, but that is the number one. There's a clear path on what to do here, but why can't we
educate?
Do it?
Yeah. Why can't we educate the mental health professionals that are treating and helping these mothers? Why can't we educate everyone so they know what to look for? New families. It should be part of any kind of postpartum issues, should be part of your OBGYN appointments. When you've had a child, you should have some kind of literature or a pamphlet or something that can educate you on what to look for. I had a small, just little page.
But did it say postpartum psychosis?
It did not say anything.
Right?
It just said, are you feeling down? Are you, and it got specific. Now, I'll tell you, I had wonderful support in my doctor's office, constantly asked me how I was doing. And that was amazing. So they were very pro.
You know what we need to do? We need to just reach out to a women's clinic and ask to interview them, and just start asking people, what do they have that out there? Because when I had my last baby was 2020. Your last baby was
2018.
So it is interesting to see that. I know it's becoming more talked about, but that is progress.
Yeah.
But it'd be cool to find out, we'll look up statistics and see how many clinics are educating women on.
I'd like to ask. I can reach out to my OB. She's amazing. I'll see if she'd be willing to help us, because I'm sure she knows. She's with a large hospital system here in the Atlanta area, and I bet she would know probably a lot of those statistics. I bet they have training within the hospital.
I'm sure, yeah.
Because they did a really good job with me both times. So
yeah, because then that would mean that it just wasn't as common.
Yeah.
Back then, but we're learning more.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we want to get to in this series is that problem with the justice system and why there is such a disconnect, especially in medical cases like this. So we're going to talk to some attorneys and to some mental health experts to really get into that question.
We're also going to we've worked alongside a lot of professionals at Postpartum Support International, and they are an amazing nonprofit organization that work really hard to educate and provide help to all demographics, to all
color, creed,
socioeconomic status. Thank you. And they work with everyone that needs help, no matter what you need. We will speak with some legal experts there too. They really do work hard to try to bridge the gap, not only postpartum psychosis, but other postpartum issues in the legal system, and helping to understand. So
since we're talking about the justice system, let's jump into the healthcare system. Long before this case ever reached a courtroom, it moved through the healthcare system. Before prosecutors became involved, there were doctors. Before defense attorneys, there were psychiatrists. Before anyone publicly debated this case, there were appointments, medication changes, symptoms, hospital admissions, follow-up visits, and people all trying to understand what Lindsay was experiencing. That's why this case has taken so long to finally come to trial, because of all the discovery needed in this case. Mental health professionals, experts weighing in and gathering information. But for Lindsay, this was just life beforehand. And another reason I think it's so heavily debated is because she wasn't someone disconnected from care. I mean, she was a labor and delivery nurse, so she knew about maternal mental health. She was already seeking help. She was getting care. She had a medical contact. She had someone looking out for her and for this very thing that eventually happened, which is what I think is so devastating. People say slipped through the cracks. I don't believe that's a fair description. She was getting help. So I don't think it was slipping through a crack. I think it was a bigger problem with the system itself.
I agree. She checked herself into a mental health hospital.
Yeah.
Like she was really trying.
Yeah. She was discharged a week before this happened. I mean, think about that. That's heartbreaking. And that's why you have so many people looking back in hindsight saying, what if this happened? What if that happened? It's always easier in hindsight. But it boils down to this basic question. If someone with knowledge of mothers, babies, healthcare system, if that person can still have a severe crisis, an unthinkable tragedy like this happen, what does that tell us about how we recognize postpartum emergencies, right?
Yeah. I mean, by many accounts, her life was perfect. They had the perfect family life prior to this illness. And that is something that a lot of mothers understand, is even if their experiences were nowhere near this case now, there's a gap, and there can be a gap of how you look and how you feel, especially being a new mother. I know we know that.
Yeah.
And a gap between functioning and being well. I know that my favorite saying with both my children when they were born was, I'm just trying to survive. I'm doing my best, and I'm making sure my children are loved and taken care of, and I'm doing my best. And I passed that on to all of my friends as well. And it became a joke amongst us that it's survival mode. And so in saying that, there is a gap between functioning and being well. Okay. And that does not mean that every struggling mother is dangerous to herself or to her children or her family, or that is not what we're saying. In fact, it is actually the opposite. Most mothers who struggle with postpartum psychosis, anxiety, depression, OCD, intrusive thoughts, or other perinatal mental health conditions will never harm their children. They're not dangerous. Now, we did learn that suicide is more common than inflicting any kind of harm to anyone else besides yourself, but it's postpartum psychosis is very dangerous, but is a treatable illness. And the serious symptoms deserve lots of attention, immediate medical attention. And when psychosis is even a possibility, experts are clear that it should be treated as such, as a medical emergency.
Yeah, and I was just thinking what you were talking about with when we're so worried about our children surviving. It's so often easy to kind of worry about how you're surviving, how you're doing. Are you keeping yourself alive at the same time?
Yeah.
And when you talked about self-harm, let's not forget that Lindsay Clancy was found on the freezing ground outside her house after she cut both her wrists and jumped off the top story. And it's not as often that you'll see all the children. It's usually, it's not always that. But I always like to think about moms that this does happen to, because their case doesn't make national headlines. It doesn't, you might not even read about it. A family might try to actually keep that quiet, and you wouldn't want to put that out there. But the more we hide what's happening, the less we see how prevalent it is. And I find that fascinating as well, because that's a loss just as devastating. And so we got to keep that in mind when we're talking about past cases and what's making headlines.
That's right. There's so many cases that didn't make any of the headlines. that we ended up researching. We didn't know anything about them until mental health professionals that we had interviewed mentioned them.
Yeah.
And then we had to really do a deep dive to find them. But it's actually quite odd when you learn more about postpartum psychosis, how similar the cases are.
Yeah.
And what that state of psychosis actually does to your brain and into your life. So postpartum psychosis is a medical emergency. And that is one of the reasons language matters so much, because if a mother is having intrusive thoughts, which we discussed, and is terrified by them, that may point in one direction. If a mother is experiencing delusions or hallucinations and believes that something false is real, that may point in another direction. If a mother is severely sleep deprived, blessed Lord knows, that's agitated, paranoid, or disconnected from reality, that may require immediate intervention, medical intervention. And the words are not just labels. They guide the response and what help is needed. And if the wrong words are used or misunderstood, the wrong response may follow.
Yeah, we talked to a few different medical health professionals who said that that is something that is like an art. Getting someone to talk honestly and openly about what they're going through, especially in our generation, day and age, where you don't want to put it all out there because you're nervous. For women especially, a lot of moms are worried that their babies will be taken from them, that they will be put into a facility without their consent. And I could see how that would be terrifying, because you know you need the help, but you don't want to admit guilt or admit wrongdoing, even though when you're in this medical emergency, it's not your own choosing. It's not your own wrongdoing. It's your body and mind working against you. Dr. Elizabeth O'Brien is one of those professionals. And I'm going to ask her this question, see her take is, how do clinicians distinguish between postpartum depression, postpartum OCD, intrusive thoughts, and postpartum psychosis? So as we kept studying this timeline of Lindsay Clancy's, we kept noticing how painfully ordinary the events were on the day that her children's lives were lost. Because according to public reporting, that day included a pediatric appointment, pictures of the kids playing outside in the snow, texts about the kids, a request for Patrick to pick up medication while he was already out getting dinner, all those kinds of things that parents do every single day of their lives. And yet those ordinary moments exist alongside one of the most unimaginable tragedies a family could ever experience, the end of a family, essentially. So holding those two realities is really hard. But if we ignore either one, we're not really getting a full concept of the case.
That is what kept pulling us back to. The human brain wants one clean story. Okay, either she was a monster or she was in a state of psychosis. Either she planned it or she had no idea what she was doing, or the system failed, or either the system had nothing to do with it. So the reality may be much more complicated than even one sentence can hold.
Yeah.
And that is what a courtroom is going to have to eventually sort through.
Very soon.
Very soon.
I think these are all things that are going to be very important during voir dire, because that jury makeup, it matters, because you can guarantee that they're looking for specific types of people on both sides. One of the hardest parts of this series is that the courtroom and the public are not always trying to answer the same question. The public wants to know, how could this happen? Medical experts may be asking, what illness is present? How did that affect Lindsay's thinking? And the defense may be arguing postpartum psychosis or severe mental illness shaped the state of her mind on the evening of the crimes. The prosecution will likely focus on the planning, the intent, her responsibility, her MapQuest looks, Google searches, all of these things that show that she was fully capable of thinking when she made the conscious decision to kill her 3 children. And the jury will eventually be asked to apply the law, to use their common sense and come to a sensible conclusion. That is a very different task from trying to emotionally understand what the hell happened here.
We want to be careful here. We are not here to decide this case.
Right.
We're not here to tell anyone what the verdict should be. We are here to understand what questions are going to be raised during the trial and what questions are raised now, even with us from the beginning since this tragedy occurred. The case sits at the intersection of 2 systems that do not speak the same language. That's basically the easiest way to explain it. The justice system and the medical system. So medical and law. Okay. And medicine may look at the symptoms, practicing medicine, doctors, they look at the symptoms, the diagnosis, treatment, risk factors, and psychiatric emergency if that is what entails. Law looks at criminal responsibility, intent, the capacity to commit crime, and whether the legal standard is met. Both of these matter, but they are not the same thing.
Yeah, and that distinction, I think, is what we're going to keep coming back to, right? Because a diagnosis alone doesn't answer the legal question, and a criminal charge by itself doesn't answer the medical one. So you're kind of like stuck between a rock and a hard place. And that's why these cases are so difficult. They force juries, attorneys, the public, everybody to sit with two truths at once, which are the children are dead and a mother may have been severely mentally ill at the time that her children died at her hands. Those truths do not cancel each other out. You can't take one without the other. They exist together. And I think that is why postpartum psychosis and child death is it's got to be the most emotionally and legally difficult concepts to prove.
Yeah, because legally, the court system says her children died at her hands. That's how we speak the language. We don't say she killed her children, but
can you explain why we don't say that?
Nope, I don't remember. I just know that it's something that we are very careful with because the mother isn't in control when it happens. So in a state of psychosis, she did not intentionally murder or kill her children.
Well, to be fair, that's what we're going to find out in this trial.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say here.
But we're not making the decision for you.
We're not making the decision.
We're going to come to a conclusion with you.
Yes, what we're trying to tell you is that with these cases of postpartum psychosis is that they know Andrea Yates. It was never a question that the children died at her hands. It was never a question with Carol Coronado. And in this case, it was not a question that Lindsay.
Yeah. And there isn't a case. Yeah. I mean, they are looping. They were asking if they could exclude that. They can't. So that is a part of this case, but she's conceded to it. Everyone agrees and understands what happened. I do think, though, we keep talking about language, and that's why I just have a trouble with the word kill. If you're a convicted killer, a jury deems that you did this. It's fitting term. Before there's been a jury involved, I just think the word kill does hold a little too much intent. But her children are dead and they died at her hands.
Yes. And she tried to commit suicide as well. And I know in some states that's also incites a criminal charge.
Yeah. Attempting to end your own life at your own hands.
Exactly.
To answer these questions for me is we have to go now back in time to look at how we've traditionally handled these cases. And then we're going to compare them against how other countries handle these cases, because this has been happening since the beginning of time, you know? Yeah. It's not like a new thing. Why, though, have we not figured this out yet? Mm-hmm. Why is it taking so long to figure this out?
Why does it even have to get to this point? That's what I personally want to change is, can we, set standards in mental health and in the DSM and in medical practices and not even get to the point where anybody's harmed, where they are treated, they're hospitalized, they get the help they need, and no one is harmed and families live on.
When we first really started researching Lindsay's case, we noticed another name kept popping up randomly, not just in social media, but in medical journals, in legal discussions, expert interviews, almost every serious conversation we were having about postpartum psychosis and criminal responsibility. Andrea Yates kept popping up. Like a lot of people, we thought we knew that case. A mother of 5, a bathtub, a trial, a national outcry. But we were wrong because we were still doing what we don't like. We were reducing her to headlines. And then the more we got into all those clinical conversations and legal reviews and court documents, it's a much bigger story and one that's strikingly similar to Lindsay Clancy.
Mm-hmm. At first, you might think people brought up Andrea Yates simply because both cases involved the children dying at their mother's hands. But that is not why the experts keep returning to Andrea's case. They return to it because Andrea Yates became one of the most important American cases in the public understanding of postpartum psychosis. Legal insanity, the warning signs, psychiatric treatment, and maternal filicide. Her case changed the conversation forever, but it did not end it.
Right. And it's important to say this right now that Lindsay Clancy and Andrea Yates have completely different cases.
Yes.
There's different set of facts. There's different medical histories. There's legal issues that are different legal issues at play. So they're nowhere near the same kind of family, even different locations, different background. But when a new case raises these really difficult questions about postpartum psychosis or responsibility, criminal responsibility, the legal and medical worlds aren't starting over from scratch, because that would be actually exhausting. And in legal cases, we call that precedent, or we look to what has already happened and what rulings were made then, and then how do we apply that to a situation that is similar.
So before we move deeper into Lindsay Clancy's upcoming trial, we have to go back to Andrea Yates. We have to not compare them for shock value, which is not what we're going to do, but to understand the legal and medical history that still shapes this conversation 25 years later after the worst day of Andrea Yates' life. Because Andrea's case forces us to ask questions we are still asking today. What does psychosis look like? What warning signs were visible? What did doctors know? What did families misunderstand or maybe not recognize? What does the law require? And how does a jury decide whether a mother who committed an unimaginable act be legally responsible for it?
Yeah, and that's where we're going next. We're going to start with Andrea Yates, but we're also going to look at some other cases that have striking similarities. One thing that I found interesting when looking is a lot of people hear voices, and it's often God talking directly to them.
Or the devil.
Or the devil.
Yeah.
And that actually, as you'll learn with us, plays a factor sometimes in juries. And that's what I want to keep reminding everyone to think of as we go through these explanations or these, different events. Think about how a jury might perceive that event, because that's what the attorneys are trying to do. And when we're looking at these different cases, like Carol Coronado is a great example, it's not about one woman. It's not about one case. It's really more about the pattern of misunderstandings, the pattern of failures, systemic failures, the pattern of misunderstandings, public misinterpretation. And hopefully, out of all that, we are determined to find a path to prevention.
I love that. When we started this project, we saw a gap between what mothers experience and what they say out loud, the gap between the medical language and the public understanding, the gap between treatment and medical crisis, the gap between the emergency room and the courtroom, and the gap between what the law can decide and what prevention demands.
Our goal isn't going to make this easier. It's not to make this more easy to understand. This is hard to understand. And I'm going to probably start getting emotional because that's how much this project has meant to me, because it is emotional. It is important that for women everywhere that we understand and listen and see Lindsay's story. Because if we're going to talk about mothers who kill their children, we have to be able to talk about the children, the families, the fathers, the mental health providers, the lawyers, every part of this story we have to look at and understand, because this is devastating. This is absolutely devastating. We have to send our children out of the room to talk about these stories because it's so devastating. And it's got to stop. We've got to start making some kind of change. And this is the way I think we do it.
This is very important to us and very close to our hearts, because at the end of the day, if we can save one child, one family, one mother, that's our goal here. And ultimately, we would love to get postpartum psychosis entered as a standalone disorder into the DSM and to create some kind of medical knowledge somehow with someone to educate these providers who are treating these ladies and after childbirth. Like, if I feel like this would have went a whole different way if she would have gotten the help she was begging for. And that's my personal opinion.
I also think that we need to educate our courtrooms and our justice system, because if we're not acknowledging this as a diagnosis, how are we supposed to defend it? If we're still not, there shouldn't be charges. Why are there charges here? Why are there murder charges here? Where is the system failing her? Or maybe they're not. We're going to find this out. But I have a feeling that we're going to see that there's a lot of holes in both systems.
I agree. Next time, we're going to go back to the case that changed the national conversation around postpartum psychosis. And that's, like we discussed, Andrea Yates. And 25 years later, her case is still one of the most important and misunderstood cases in America. If this episode brought up something for you or someone you love, please reach out. Postpartum psychosis is a medical emergency and help is available.
Thank you guys for joining us in our first episode of Motherhood on Trial. This is Autumn Cross. I'm Beth Justice. Until next time, keep asking tough questions.
Because motherhood, mental illness, and justice deserve more than a headline.
This is Motherhood on Trial. Please join us next time as we continue to explore the unspoken truths.